intersection of race and nuclear weapons? It would be on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. It's something that I feel that I am an expert in and know well, but also it's because it is interdisciplinary. It is something that is lacking right now in terms of representation or in terms of those connections. And so, and especially with the role of the global South that we're seeing today in the struggle to eliminate nuclear weapons, I think it is pressing and obviously important. So there's not an aha moment. It's not as if I saw one thing and then it was always different layers. So for most of my life as an academic and as an activist, I was involved in civil rights issues. I was involved in the Black Freedom Movement issues, or issues revolving around the Black Freedom Movement. And so nuclear weapons was not really on my radar as a kid. It seemed very abstract. Nobody would be crazy enough to use them, so I wasn't concerned about them. And that changed for me the first time I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was in 2005. And I was so filled with rage and guilt and anger about what my country had done that I remember returning and then saying, I need to figure out how to combine these two issues that mean so much to me, eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons. And so I started with just asking the question, what did African Americans think about dropping the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And that kind of started on my path. So I come from a working class family in upstate New York, in Syracuse, New York. My parents were both too poor to go to college. And so like many, I was instilled to go to college to make sure I was financially secure. And so I actually got my first degree in economics, and I absolutely hated it. When I should be studying economics, I was reading African American history and things of that nature. And so I decided to go back, and making that decision was also, I was very aware of what gifts I had and what I didn't have. I have zero artistic ability whatsoever. I can't play a musical instrument to save my life, can't draw a stick figure. So I knew nobody was going to pay me to strum a guitar in a coffee shop or listen to my really bad poetry. So it was my ability to write, my ability to teach. And so I knew I wanted to go back and be a professor, but that meant going for the whole truckload, which would be a master's degree and a PhD. And so I went for my undergraduate was in the SUNY system, which is the State University of New York system. It's an umbrella system. And so I had gone to SUNY Potsdam for my degree in economics. Then I went to SUNY Oswego for my master's degree in history. And then for my doctorate, I went to American University in Washington, D.C. And that was part because at the time they were the most politically active school in the United States. And they also had the Nuclear Studies Institute, which is what ultimately got me to Japan. So that was the educational path that I took. And then I got my first job in teaching in teaching at a university or college in 2009, right at the height of the recession in the United States. And so that brought me down to Florida. And I was in Florida for about 5 years teaching at Seminole State College, and then came back up to the DC area for the job I currently have at Montgomery College. If I would have done things differently, I probably would have pursued maybe more of the Ivy League schools that I was looking at or that were looking at me, because it does, if you are going for an academic position, at least in the United States, it does matter where you get your degrees from. And while American University is still a very good school, it's still not Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. And so you still, if you can get into those schools and they work for you, then I would advise going to those schools, especially for this kind of industry. So that would be one thing I would look at. But again, those necessarily, people don't have the means, people don't, have the money to go to those schools. And so it's not an option for everybody. Going to Japan was incredible. Again, I had never been to Japan, never been to any parts of Asia for that matter. And again, nuclear weapons wasn't something that was huge on my radar. So my perspective going there was, hey, you're in college, this is the time to travel, and you are somewhat a little bit interested in this. So I read John Hersey's Hiroshima and some other books, and so I went, and we partnered with the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. I used to partner with Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. So it'd usually be about 40 students, half from the US and then half from Ritsumeikan, and we would be partnered together in what are called peace groups, which is 2 American and 2 Japanese students together. So you're having that bonding experience, but we're usually all together in as a group. And it was incredible because here I was as a first year graduate student, never had been there. And when everybody has individual moments, I think, when they're there. And so and I say it because from 2009 to about 2014, I was director of research for this institute. So then I was bringing students there. So I was getting to see, what they were going through. And for me, what the museums are incredible. They are nothing like we have in the United States. We are very good at celebrating war in the United States. There's war memorials everywhere, but peace, not so much. We have one peace museum in Dayton, Ohio, and, it's smaller than the room I'm in. But in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is such a big deal. And the museums are so graphic and informational, and you can't help but thinking that you're an American here and what our country did. We would go to the ceremonies. We were private guests of the mayors. We were, and after seeing such hardcore stuff all day long and hearing testimony from atomic bomb survivors and learning from experts, then the students would have that bonding experience of going out to dinner together, going to karaoke, going out for the night, because you have to have something to kind of decompress. We would often have these sessions where everybody's kind of just in their PJs and talking about what they experienced for the day and so on and so forth. And so for me personally, and everybody has their own kind of story, for me personally, what got me was the lantern ceremony. So on August 6th in Hiroshima, the night of the atomic bombing, there's what's called the lantern ceremony. And there's a very famous river that runs through the area of where the atomic bombing was dropped. It's right next to what's called the T bridge. And we call it a T bridge because if you take an aerial photo, it actually looks like a T, and it's right near the atomic bomb dome. And so this was a visual for the pilots when they were dropping it. And when it dropped, that river, so many people were jumping into that river to try to stay alive and were badly burned and injured. And what we then found out was that depending on the time of day, the tide of that river could be salt water. So one can only imagine the pain that those people were suffering from. And so on that night, there is music and atomic bomb survivors, media and regular people, and it is just, there's thousands of people that are commemorating what happened, and it is very solemn. And one of the things they have are floating lanterns. And so we would give the kids, so I did this, but then we also give our students the materials where you go through the line and you are actually making your own floating lantern with your own messages on it. And then you, with your Japanese friends, you're going in the water and physically putting it in there yourself. And I remember after a week or so of everything that I had seen, going through this line, and all my emotions, everything that I was feeling just boiled over. And I'm just sobbing, apologizing to these Japanese students. I'm sorry for what my country did. And they were saying, no, it's not your fault. Look what we did to China. And they're crying. And it was such a moving moment for me. And every year I went back to Japan after that, I would think that I'm good. And when I would get to the lantern ceremony, I would just fall apart all over again. I'm pretty convinced that even all these years later, if I go back, it will happen. And there was a hibachi, an atomic bomb survivor, Koko Kondo Tenemoto. Her father is actually featured in John Hersey's book, Hiroshima. And she's like a grandmother to me. We've stayed such close friends and talk all the time. And she actually kind of swooped down and grabbed me when I was just a mess and just said, look, nobody's going to, these Japanese students are not going to forget what they just witnessed with you. And that, it's your job now to go back to the United States and just reach people one at a time to make sure this never happens again. And these weapons are eliminated. And it's kind of been my driving thing ever since. So I think that learning about nuclear weapons and what they do and eliminating them among, of course, all people is incredibly important. The problem was that for so long in this history, the history wasn't focused. There was, when I wrote the African Americans Against the Bomb in 2015, there was barely anything written at all focusing on African Americans in this struggle. The general consensus was that African Americans were too busy trying to gain their own freedom and equality and didn't have time simply to worry about this issue, which is completely understandable. That just wasn't the case. And since 1945, all the way up, it was African Americans that were involved in this issue, and it's sometimes even in leadership roles. So for me, I saw this kind of, when I look at African American history specifically, I look at it as a giant brick wall, and there are still bricks that need to be filled in, because for so long that history was written by white racist Southern men for years in this country. So it wasn't until the late 1960s when Black students and other students of color were saying, we want history taught from our point of view. This is where you see the emergence of Black studies programs, Chicano studies, Native American studies. And so we still have a lot of catching up to do in that regard in terms of looking in archives, looking at materials. And so when it came to nuclear disarmament, I saw a big brick that was missing in that narrative of African American history, and I wanted to fill that in. And the goal is that if somebody was looking for themselves in this history and hadn't been able to see themselves, a Black student could go and read this book and say, here is Martin, here is Lorraine Hansberry, here is Malcolm, here is Du Bois, and say, these people look like me. And they're explaining how this issue, whether it's through colonialism or whether it's economic conversion, how this matters to me and why I should be involved in it. I see myself in it. And then those that are involved in the peace movement or nuclear disarmament would say, oh my gosh, I never realized that whether it's nuclear testing or uranium mining or production or threatening to use it on people, that it's so often people of color that are the victims of these kind of things. And so to me, these things are inextricably linked, but it's still a history that is we're just playing catch up with. And so how do you get more of this out there? It's education. And education, though, so often in this field focuses on the graduate level or the undergrad level. And I think we need to go much earlier, right? So there are students in predominantly Black and brown schools in inner cities, economically depressed areas today, that if you went to them and asked them if they knew about highly enriched, if they knew that there were schools like MIST in Monterey, if they knew that there were all of these things going on, they would have no idea. So most of my students, 18, 19-year-olds, are coming into the classroom never learning about any of this. So it's not that we don't have the knowledge, and it's not that we don't have we're not putting together the tools as highly enriched is doing. The next step now is how do we get that into much younger hands at a much earlier age to people that have no idea about this topic, right? So for example, when we look and say, I'm in Washington, D.C., in a place like Baltimore, right? Well, last year, and I'm sure it'll happen again this year, they were asking parents to bring in space heaters because they didn't have enough money to heat the public schools in Baltimore. Well, once parents learn that we're spending $1 trillion on nuclear weapons when we have enough to eliminate the world multiple times over, and then they see that they don't have money for heat in their schools and start making those connections, that's when they realize that they should be invested in this issue because it is directly impacting them. And so there's many ways like that we can, make those connections. And I think it's vitally important because when we see the nuclear disarmament movement at its height, if you will, the most effective, especially in the 1980s, you had significant participation from the Black community, from the Hispanic community, from other groups that are typically marginalized and ignored in this fight. And so that's why I think it's important to make sure that people are seen in this history. So I think there's, in terms specifically about nuclear weapons, we are looking at a time, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, whether it's China, whether it's not trying to get the Iran nuclear deal back on the table, the US's nuclear budget. We have seen we are at a heightened awareness of all things nuclear that we really haven't seen in a long time, since the 80s, since the Cuban Missile Crisis even. And so I believe now is a time for us to really educate the public and try to do something significant on this issue. And for me, that issue is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. I think the TPNW, in terms of its what it's trying to do, what it has already accomplished, the amount of focus on the human impact of nuclear weapons and the impact it has on the global South. But it also provides agency for ordinary folks. So much like the Freeze Initiative in the 1980s, the TPNW allows people that normally would say, I don't know what to do about this. It's too overwhelming. It's too abstract. It's too much. To be able to say, I can take this and I can go to my city council, my mayor, my governor. I can go to my school. There's all different ways that you can take that and go with it. And I think much like the landmine treaty, much like chemical weapons, that the TPNW is a way to delegitimize these weapons. And it is it's a tool to build up to a critical mass to say that these weapons need to be fully eliminated. And so as we look at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT is kind of always being told it's the cornerstone of disarmament and non-proliferation. I would argue that the TPNW is the capstone. And so there's a lot of floors we kind of need to fill in building that house, but that's what I think our focus should be on. And that's certainly what my focus is on. My focus right now is how do we educate a part of the public that lacks that education, and then how do we move forward on the TPNW.